you came in, and if you didn't, you should have some. And we are going to collect your questions, and you would want to move those to the center of the aisle where our graduate students, the Schwartz research assistants, will collect them, sort them, probably censor them, and give them to the speaker. That was a joke, right? All right. So what I'll do now is introduce our speakers in the order of appearance so that we have the full time to listen to our panel. Tonight, our Bernard Schwartz Distinguished Lecturer is, and it's a great honor to introduce him, is Robert Shiller. He is the author and Oken Professor of Economics at Yale University. He received his BA from University of Michigan and his PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Shiller also has an index named after him. I mean, astronomers, wait for comets, economists wait for indices or effects. But Professor Shiller has an index. It's the Standard & Poor's Case-Shiller Home Price Indice, which is actually being used now in economic forecasting. He also writes a regular column called Finance in the 21st Century for a project called Project Syndicate. It's on the web, and it's published around the world, and I highly recommend it. I've been reading it for years. And he also writes a column for the New York Times called Economic View. Professor Shiller has written 7 books since 1989, 5 in the last 9 years. And further fueling the jealousy of academics, these books are read widely, as if having an index wasn't enough to fuel that envy. Those books include Irrational Exuberance, which is an analysis of speculative bubbles. And there's also a great website attached to that book with a lot of the graphs in the book are updated. He also just published a couple of years ago, The Subprime Solution, How the Global Finance Crisis Happened and What to Do About It. That book is also well-timed. The subject of tonight's lecture is his new book written with George Akerlof called Animal Spirits, How Human Psychology Drives the Economy and Why It Matters for Global Capitalism. Professor Shiller will speak for about 15 minutes. Our next speaker is Brad DeLong, a professor of economics in the Department of Economics at UC Berkeley. For 2 years, starting in 1993, he worked for the U.S. Treasury Department as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy. Before joining the Treasury Department, he was at Harvard, the National Bureau of Economic Research, Boston University, and at MIT. He's an economist because he integrates the studies of business cycle, economic growth, behavioral finance, political economy, with an emphasis on economic history and the history of economic thought. The profession and the public is indebted to Brad DeLong for his very popular and useful website that carries debate on current economic topics and also is a place where you go to look for vital data of the day. And it's occasionally pretty funny. Shiller's website doesn't have as many laughs, but it does have a lot of good graphs. Brad will speak for about 11 minutes. Jeff Madrick and I will represent the New School with our comments. Jeff is a research associate with SEPA, and he's a distinguished economic writer and an author of a new book on government policy making. And our remarks will be 5 minutes long. So I will introduce you to Robert Shiller. Please welcome him. Oh, did I say 35? I meant 35. I meant 35 minutes. 35 minutes, I'm sorry. Right.
Well, thank you. I share your enthusiasm, which you say pervades the New School, for a broad historical, institutional, social science perspective.
Good.
And I believe that academics have a tendency to be too compartmentalized. It's part of the incentive problem that we have, that academics value very highly being on the forefront of the frontier. And that seems to many of them to mean narrow specialization. And it works pretty well in some fields. I think it works less well in economics. Or it can work, but it doesn't help us to deal with the problem that we're facing today, the economic crisis. The global financial crisis has many different aspects to it, and it requires some broad thinking. So I saw copies of my book out there.
Yes, that's right.
So, yeah.
Here they are, and the ones out there are for sale.
That's with George Akerlof.
Right.
So I guess this ranks as our first book talk, because it hasn't been out. In fact, it just appeared on Amazon. Amazon.com gave the publication date as February 18.
Yeah.
The Princeton says March 1st. And I thought reviews were supposed to be embargoed until that date, but apparently not, because a couple have come out. But I still haven't worked up a talk that is focused entirely on a book. So as an author, I'm missing an opportunity to focus my talk on my book. But actually, it all works around it, because I really value relevance to the current crisis, and so I'm going to talk about the current crisis with references to the book. So there's a lot of factors in this. I think it's partly because the kind of crisis that we're going through is a rare event. It develops because of complacency since the last crisis. It's a little bit like wars. They say, World War I happened because it was so many years since the Napoleonic War, and people forgot how terrible it really was. It's the same thing now. After a number of years pass, we think that an event like the Great Depression couldn't possibly happen again, because we've gotten so smart, haven't we? Conventional wisdom develops. There was a remarkable wisdom that developed that real estate prices only go up. And somehow people thought that was wisdom. Herd behavior. We tend to assume naturally that when other people all say something, it's probably true. And we disregard the fact that there are certain kinds of things that everyone says that aren't true. People tend to self-censor. You are embarrassed to bring up the possibility that we could have a financial crisis because it sounds bad. It sounds flaky. I know this because I personally went through bringing up the possibility that there could be a crisis or even a severe recession. I don't think I like to use the D word until recently, because that sounds really flaky to bring that up in 2005. I remember talking to George Akerlof when we were writing the book. I was saying, should we talk about the possibility of a depression? I kind of had a feeling, but it was just a feeling, right? And so at that point, we felt reticent to talk about it. As the book progressed and this terrible crisis developed, we started to bring it in more. This book we've been working on for 6 years, but we only came out with it now because we thought if we don't come out with it now, it'll be way too late. History passes you by. But I think the essential thing that we have to think about in understanding this crisis is the bubbles that we saw in the financial market. So I wanted to show you pictures of them. And this thing here, the blue line, is the S&P stock price index, composite stock price index, going back to 1871. And you can see the remarkable behavior. This is 2000, and this is 2008. And we have come down 55% from the 2000 peak. So this is a pretty unique, almost unique event. If you want to look for another event like it, you have to go back to 1929, which is here. The stock market went down 80% in real terms then. I do everything in real terms because I'm an economist, so it's corrected for inflation. So we haven't, it's not quite the Depression again, but it's kind of on the way, right? 55% down, 80% down. And this is the whole history of the U.S. stock market. There's no other episode, maybe this one around 74, like the recent ones. So I think that what happened was we had a speculative boom, and it was a psychological event that drove the market up to high levels, and we've corrected down from it. And one of the themes that George Akerlof and I are emphasizing is that psychology really matters, and that it's also technical economic factors, but you can't ignore the psychology, which unfortunately the economic profession has tended to do with recent theorizing. The so-called efficient markets hypothesis, which says that markets efficiently incorporate all information and work with precision, which I think is one of the most remarkable errors in the history of economic thought. This is not efficient markets, these events. This is the price-earnings ratio back to 1881, with the 10-year moving average earnings as the denominator. So it tells you how pricey is the market relative to the earnings that support the market. And you can see the remarkable events we've been through recently. In 2000, the price-earnings ratio got up to 46 briefly, whereas the historical average was 15. The only other time when it had been nearly so high was 1929 there, but the recent event is more spectacular than 29. Some people say, well, the price-earnings ratio just reflects interest rates and tends to move opposite interest rates. And that seemed to be true for a while around here. You can see how they move opposite in this range, each other, but it doesn't work generally. So I think it's not interest rates that are primarily driving these things, it's bubbles. So we've had two spectacular bubbles. This is the 1920s, the roaring 20s, when confidence seemed to get very high, and then it evaporated with intense rapidity after 1929, and really surprised people. People in the early 1930s were saying, what is wrong? There's nothing wrong with the economy. I'll quote Franklin Roosevelt in his 1933 inaugural address. He said, there is no plague of locusts. Nothing is wrong with the economy. The only thing to fear is fear itself. To him, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy that if we get very negative in our expectations, we all stop buying and businesses stop expanding, they stop hiring, and it just all bogs down. And that's what's happened. And it seems to me that the psychology, this is introspective and based partly on surveys, the psychology is changing very fast right now all over the world. It's not just the US. A recent poll by the Michigan Survey Research Center said that almost 2/3 of Americans think that this slowdown will last 5 more years. I was just asked to appear on a TV show in Australia, and I was talking with the Australian producer of the show. It's about the crisis. And she was telling me about how panicked Australians are right now. But I don't think it's just the US, it's not just Australia. There is a psychological change with the decline in our animal spirits, I'd say. I'm trying to emphasize how international it is. This is the Nikkei stock price index for Japan. Now, the interesting thing about Japan is they had a huge boom in their stock market in the 1980s. And that was the time when the Japanese economy seemed to be winning all over the world. And then this tremendous collapse. They talked about the lost decade in Japan. So the lost decade was somewhere in the 90s. President Obama referred to it in his first press conference just a short time ago. But unfortunately, it's gone on longer than a decade. And what is that, like a decade and a half? And now the Japanese economy is sinking further. In fact, in their fourth quarter GDP, it declined at an annual rate of 12%. So there was this excitement and optimism in Japan in the 1980s, and it kind of left